Hello, my name's David Chernikoff, and I've been asked by my friends at the Boulder Bookstore to speak a little bit about my recently released book, Life Part 2, 7 Keys to Awakening with Purpose and Joy as You Age. They were kind enough to make some suggestions and ask me to respond to some questions that might help some of you who would potentially be interested in this book to learn a little bit about the background involved with it. The first question that they asked me about had to do with what inspired me to write this book. There were actually 3 different aspects to that. The first of which had to do with how much I've loved reading my entire life, pretty much since I was a toddler and was exposed to books. There's a certain point at which I realized that it could be really a joy and a meaningful and rich experience to try to offer to some other people the kind of experience that I have had with so many books throughout the course of my life, in which I found meaning and new understanding and insight and a certain kind of happiness that comes with a deepening appreciation for the richness of our lives. Another reason that I wrote the book was that a few years back I was approaching my 70th birthday, and I realized that in addition to that marking point, I was also approaching a kind of 50-year anniversary of when I was first introduced to meditation and spiritual teachings as a 21-year-old college student. In the course of recognizing that I felt called to do a certain kind of life review, I began to look at the question, what have I learned in these many years of working with meditation and prayer and various contemplative teachings across numerous traditions? And along with that question, the question, would I be able to share in writing some of the most valuable lessons and learnings that have come from that experience over the years? And that's what I set out to do, partly on a personal basis as a kind of life review and reminiscence. And yet I wanted to do something other than just a memoir. I wanted to pass along the teachings that I've benefited from and the good fortune that I've experienced in relation to having the opportunity to sit with and learn from some really marvelous teachers over the years. People like Ram Dass, Sharon Salzberg, Roshi Joan Halifax, Father Thomas Keating, Swami Satchidananda, Zen teacher Yvonne Rand, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and numerous others. I feel tremendous gratitude to these people for the teachings that they've offered over the years and how helpful those teachings have been in my life. And I realized in this time of reflection that one way I could express that appreciation was to pass along those teachings as I have come to know them. So all of those came into play and led me to want to write this book. And it was really a great joy. Although I wasn't primarily trained as a writer, I've been a journal writer much of my adult life. I've written short articles and newsletter articles and things of that sort. But mostly I've been a stand-up teacher in a variety of different settings for most of my adult life. And I thought it would be interesting too to explore the craft of writing on a larger scale than an article. A second question that was brought to my attention, which I think is relevant for many of us in this culture, is the question, why do I think there are so many people in Western society who are afraid of aging? And I think there's a primary reason for that, which has to do with cultural conditioning. Unlike many wise indigenous cultures, in our culture from an early age, we're given the message that the experience of becoming an older human being is a descent into a life of gradual gradually increasing irrelevance, disability, pain, and unhappiness. And while it's true that there are certain challenges that we have to realistically face when we become an older person, what's missing in that particular cultural formulation and what's problematic about that message is the fact that for many, many people, becoming an older human being is a time of tremendous fruition and richness and celebration, even if there are physical and psychological limitations of various kinds that arise, as they sometimes do. As we see in indigenous cultures, it's possible for those of us who are becoming older people to see ourselves as potentially wise elders. And if we're willing to do a certain inner contemplative work, we are then in a position to offer that accumulated wisdom from long life experience that we've synthesized in our experience of life review and reminiscence and aging. We can offer that back to a society that many of us would agree need as much wisdom and love and spiritual maturity as we can muster at this particular time. So that's my thought about that question. And I think it's one worth paying attention to, because the good news here is that it is possible for us to flush out of our systems many of the negative messages that we've absorbed from the media in our culture, and in some cases from our families of origin and various other sources, that set up the risk of what social scientists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is to say, if we formulate a belief system that tells us that our life will be a descent into irrelevance, unhappiness, pain, and suffering, ending in death, there's a very real risk that we can unconsciously create that. That's not necessary, however, if we take a deep look at our actual experience and move beyond the limitations of that cultural conditioning. Another question that I enjoyed reflecting upon and thinking about, what do I think is a great joy only found in the second half of life, which some of you might recognize as a phrase that Carl Jung used in his work. In my book, I actually discuss that term on two levels, the phrase second half of life. One has to do with chronological aging and the way that Jung used it to speak about the midlife transition and the years that followed as we became elders. I also use it to talk about certain experiences we have in our lives, which give us the sense that a whole book one of our life has ended and book two has now begun. And that can happen at any age, as some of us have experienced. It could be a cancer diagnosis at the age of 33, a bicycle accident that leaves me a paraplegic at the age of 16. It could be any number of dramatic life changes in which my familiar sense of self and how I think the world is dramatically disrupted. And I experience a sense of starting anew, which can be both frightening and exhilarating. I talk about this in the book in some depth because I think it's quite important for us to recognize that, as is said in the Zen Buddhist tradition, those who die before they die are free to really live, which is another way of saying that when who we think we are and how we think the world is changes dramatically, our sense of ourselves and the world begin again in a fresh new way. That in Buddhist teachings and other contemplative teachings is sometimes called beginner's mind. Yeah, we're open. And that's an extremely helpful way to approach our lives on a moment-to-moment and day-to-day basis. Another question that comes into play here, how did I decide on the 7 essential elements of conscious living that are discussed in the book. Two ways, essentially. I looked back at my own life. I'm now 72. I was 21 when I first got involved with meditation and various spiritual teachings. And I tried to understand how my life had unfolded in relation to the perennial wisdom teachings that we see in the great world religions and in many other spiritual and transformational systems that are not well known as religions per se. And when I looked back in that way and reviewed the way my life has unfolded, I could see that there were certain core ingredients that are shared by all the great wisdom traditions that had been a part of my own life as I was growing and changing over the years. And it was my effort to identify and articulate those core elements that led me to come up with what I called the 7 keys to awakening that I discuss in the book. While there is a certain emphasis on how we experience those in the second half of life, I would emphasize what I think a lot of us realize is that conscious aging and conscious living are, of course, one and the same process. And these 7 essential elements apply to every aspect of life, from the moment we're born until the moment our physical body dies. Next question. What is one thing that everyone in the second half of life should do every day to become a wise elder? I've already alluded to this in a sense, because this notion of beginner's mind that I spoke about a moment ago is extremely helpful. As some of you know, it was popularized by a great Zen teacher, Suzuki Roshi, who was the founder of San Francisco Zen Center in the late 1960s, who in one of his talks made a statement that's often quoted and repeated in meditation circles. He said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." So the one thing that I think we can do if we aspire to live consciously and eventually become a wise elder who can contribute to society in a significant and helpful way is to recognize that each morning that we wake up, we can choose a beginner's mind perspective and realize that the day in front of us is wide open and has yet to happen. Any number of possible unfoldings could occur in this day. And rather than having a fixed idea of what will happen, or feeling as if I know that this is going to be, quote, just another day of the same old, I can approach it as if I'm being born for the first time this day. I can open my eyes and my ears and my heart and my mind and really pay attention to try to hear what would allow me to live in harmony this day with what in Zen tradition is called the Great Way, or what in Taoist tradition is called the Tao, or what in Abrahamic traditions is called divine harmony. Yeah? It's this kind of perspective that enables us to live with a renewed sense of wonder and curiosity and interest in each day, all the way to advanced late age and perhaps even beyond. One other question. I found this particularly interesting. What have I been reading during the pandemic to stay hopeful? I love this question because I love to read and I like to share the reading that I do, which is one reason I enjoy being one of the guiding teachers for the Insight Meditation Community of Colorado, where I have an opportunity to teach a couple times a week, and why I like to teach retreats and share what I learned from books in various Dharma talks and other kinds of teachings. One book I found extremely helpful, for obvious reasons, is called The Upside of Stress by Kelly McGonigal. It's a book that really rearranged my whole understanding of what stress is and what its role is in our lives, and the way in which certain stressful circumstances can elicit what the book calls a challenge response that actually brings out the best of who we are and what we can offer to the world, rather than being something detrimental or problematic. Another book that I liked a lot, that I've read a couple of times now, is called The Book of Joy. That was written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, and a wonderful writer named Douglas Abram, who was like the MC for an 8-day visit between the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu to celebrate the Dalai Lama's 80th birthday. To see the way in which these two icons of spiritual awakening, the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, have been able to deal with the incredible suffering and hardship in their respective situations, and at the same time maintain their joy, their joie de vivre, their love of life, and their engagement with it and excitement about it, was totally inspiring to me, and I think highly relevant to what we've been living with during this pandemic period over the last couple of years. Along the same line, a book that renewed and refreshed my faith in the way that I understand the word faith, as a trust in my own deepest experience, is a book simply called Faith, written by Sharon Salzberg, a wonderful insight meditation teacher who has contributed tremendously to the movement of meditation and related teachings into our culture and society. Her colleague, Jack Kornfield, who's been a significant mentor and teacher for me over many years, also wrote a book that has relevance during this time of challenge. One of his lesser known books that I revisited over the last couple of years is called A Lamp in the Darkness, in which he draws on traditional and contemporary Buddhist teachings as well to help us understand some specific ways in which Buddhist contemplative teachings enable us to, as Tibetans say, turn poison into medicine when we're dealing with challenge and difficulty. Jack, in an earlier book, which a very important book from my standpoint, that he wrote in 1993, A Path with Heart, had a similar teaching that he called turning straw into gold. And certainly we have a lot of straw and a lot of poison on our planet right now in terms of the difficulties that we're struggling with, and a great need to turn that poison into medicine and that straw into gold. Other books, two more come to mind that I jotted a note about. One is called The Making of an Old Soul by a wonderful writer named Carol Orsborne. Carol's a gifted writer who's written approximately 30 books, if I recall correctly. And I had the good fortune to be interviewed with her in a moderated conversation about our respective books on spirituality and aging and spiritual maturity. Carol wrote a book called The Making of an Old Soul, which addresses some of the same themes and topics that my book addresses from her unique and fascinating perspective. And I read that in part to prepare for the moderated discussion that we were going to have, and partly because it's a subject I have a great deal of interest in. The last one I'll mention is a book called The Buddhist on Death Row by a writer named David Chernikoff. It's a book about a man on death row named Jarvis Masters, who himself has written and published a number of books because he's been on death row now for approximately 40 years. It's a remarkable book in the sense that it shows how authentic spiritual teachings can be truly transformative in regard to cultivating our best human qualities, even in situations as extreme as death row in San Quentin prison in California. A very inspiring book. Jarvis Masters is currently being mentored by Pema Chodron, and prior to Pema Chodron's mentoring, he was mentored by some other Buddhist teachers who really helped him to understand the Dharma teachings, the importance of training the heart and mind, and the way that those teachings applied in any setting whatsoever, even a setting as extreme as the one he's been living in for most of his adult life. Last question here has to do with choosing a short passage to read from my book, and I'd love to do that. The one I chose is from chapter 7 in the book, which is called Celebrating the Journey. It begins with this epigraph. These days, I'm the advanced scout for the experiences of aging, and I've come back from the scouting party to bring good news. The good news is that the spirit is more powerful than the vicissitudes of aging. Ram Dass. The Dalai Lama attended a meeting of the Mind and Life Institute, a group of scientists and spiritual practitioners who gather periodically to discuss their common interest in scientific and contemplative approaches to exploring the nature of reality. Part of the meeting involved a distinguished Japanese researcher, a specialist in laughter, sharing the results of a recent study. He concluded his presentation, the last one of the day, by asking the Dalai Lama a question. Your Holiness, he said, can you tell us what was the happiest moment of your life? The audience, which included Buddhist scholars, meditation practitioners, scientists, and 100 guests, became silent and very attentive. His Holiness paused for a time, reflected thoughtfully, then suddenly said in a booming voice, I think now. Everyone in the room laughed with delight, and the meeting was adjourned. Some natural questions that arise when we consider the process of spiritual development in the second half of life are, do we ever truly arrive? How will we know when we do? Phrases like spiritual path and journey of awakening imply a movement of some kind from one place to another, or perhaps more accurately, from one mode of being to another. The way I like to phrase this inquiry is, what are the fruits of a spiritually mature life? We generally recognize them when we see them, and we're drawn to spend time with people who embody them. Who wouldn't want to be with someone for whom the happiest moment of their life is now? Yet we don't often identify and look deeply at our most excellent qualities, all of which are desperately needed in today's world. What does it mean in our fast-paced, pluralistic, and secularized society to aspire to the qualities of wise elderhood? It's clear to all of us, I imagine, that growing old does not in and of itself lead to wisdom and loving kindness. We've probably all met elderly people who are angry, frightened, self-absorbed, or hard to communicate with. It's a safe assumption that they became that way because of pain, suffering, and confusion in their lives. And it's very important that we witness their unhappiness with compassion and not with judgment. At the same time, we want to take full advantage in our own lives of what Buddhist teachings call our precious human birth, a birth in which we can make choices about how we spend our limited time on earth. The first 6 keys to conscious living represent choices that support growing up emotionally and psychologically, as well as waking up spiritually. For most people who are willing to make the commitment, the process is a gradual transition that takes place over many years. I hope this gives you some sense of what my book, Life Part 2, 7 Keys to Awakening with Purpose and Joy as You Age, is about, why I wrote it, and what I hope might be beneficial to those who read it. And if it's something that feels of interest to you, I'd be honored and privileged if you choose to pick up a copy. Thank you for your kind attention, and I wish you well.